I have been tracking Russian and Iranian strategic coordination for over 17 years, and what I am watching unfold right now in the Strait of Hormuz is the single most consequential miscalculation that Moscow and Tehran have made together in any theater of operations since the beginning of their deepened military partnership in 2015. Something has gone catastrophically wrong with the joint operational framework that Russia and Iran spent 2 years quietly constructing around the world's most critical energy choke point. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in ways that can be managed through diplomatic back channels and careful narrative control. Catastrophically, irreversibly, and publicly wrong in ways that every intelligence agency watching the Persian Gulf right now is documenting in real time, and every regional power is incorporating into its strategic recalculations with urgent attention. Russia believed that its intelligence architecture, its electronic warfare expertise, and its deep institutional knowledge of American military operational patterns gave Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy a level of operational enhancement sufficient to withstand American pressure in the Strait. That belief has been destroyed in the past 48 hours by a United States military response so precisely calibrated, so operationally sophisticated, and so devastatingly effective that neither Moscow nor Tehran had a prepared response for what happened when American forces moved into those 34 miles of water between Iran and Oman with a clarity of intent that left no room for the ambiguity that both Russia and Iran had been depending on to protect their joint operation from direct confrontation. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell immediately. Turn on all notifications because what is unfolding inside the Strait of Hormuz over the coming 10 to 14 days will determine whether the Russia-Iran strategic axis retains any meaningful operational credibility in the Persian Gulf for the foreseeable future. And I am going to show you exactly how this joint operation was constructed over 2 years of careful preparation. How the United States military detected every element of it and dismantled it with surgical precision. What Moscow was actually providing Tehran beyond what any public statement has acknowledged. Why the failure is infinitely more damaging to Russian strategic interests than the Kremlin's communications apparatus will ever publicly admit. What it means for global oil markets, that the world's most heavily trafficked energy choke point just became the site of the most significant Russia-America indirect confrontation since the Cold War, and what the countdown that is running right now on Iranian infrastructure gives every actor in this crisis exactly 10 to 14 days to respond to before the consequences become impossible to contain. To understand why the mistake that Russia and Iran made together in the Strait of Hormuz carries the historic weight that it does, it is necessary to go back to the strategic logic that drove Moscow and Tehran into their deepened operational partnership beginning in 2015 and accelerating dramatically after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 created a new architecture of mutual dependence between two sanctioned powers with complementary capabilities and overlapping strategic interests. Russia brought to this partnership something Iran had been seeking for decades, without ever finding a reliable supplier willing to provide it at the level of sophistication that Russian defense industry could offer. That something was not weapons in the conventional sense, though weapons transfers have been extensively documented. What Russia brought was the institutional knowledge, the electronic warfare expertise, the signals intelligence methodology, and the operational planning experience of a military organization that had spent decades studying American naval doctrine, American sensor architectures, American command and control vulnerabilities, and American rules of engagement constraints in exactly the kinds of confined littoral environments that define the Strait of Hormuz operational theater. Iran brought to this partnership something Russia desperately needed after February 2022 transformed Moscow from a sanctioned power operating at the margins of the international system into a comprehensively isolated pariah state dependent on a shrinking circle of partners willing to absorb the cost of association. Iran brought geographic position, operational experience in asymmetric maritime warfare, refined across 4 decades of Gulf confrontation, drone manufacturing capacity that Russia rapidly incorporated into its Ukraine operations, and a willingness to absorb shared risk in operations that neither party could acknowledge publicly. Together, these two sanctioned powers with complementary capabilities and aligned interests in challenging American dominance of critical global infrastructure built something in and around the Strait of Hormuz that American intelligence analysts spent months assessing before concluding that its operational sophistication exceeded what either party could have achieved independently. The joint operational architecture that Russia and Iran constructed around the Strait of Hormuz, as reconstructed from reporting by the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and specialized defense publications, including Jane's Intelligence Review and the U.S. Naval Institute News, rested on four mutually reinforcing elements that together gave the partnership functional influence over strait dynamics at a level that had no precedent in the history of either country's individual Gulf operations. The first element was a Russian-provided electronic warfare and signals intelligence capability deployed through Iranian coastal facilities that gave IRGCN commanders real-time awareness of American naval vessel movements, communication patterns, and sensor activation signatures throughout the strait and its approaches at a level of detail and accuracy that Iranian organic intelligence collection had never previously achieved. According to analysis by defense researchers at the Center for Strategic and International Studies based on open-source technical documentation and satellite imagery of Iranian coastal facility modifications, Russian Krasuka series electronic warfare systems or their derivatives had been integrated into Iranian coastal defense infrastructure at multiple points along the Hormuz coastline, providing a signals intelligence collection capability that specifically targeted the sensor and communication architectures of U.S. Fifth Fleet surface vessels operating in the strait. This was not Iran purchasing Russian equipment and operating it independently. This was a jointly operated intelligence collection system with Russian technical personnel maintaining the sophisticated components that Iranian operators lacked the training to sustain without direct support. The second element was a Russian-designed operational planning framework for IRGCN fast attack craft harassment operations that specifically incorporated lessons from Russian analysis of American naval responses to previous Iranian provocations, designing operational patterns intended to exploit the gaps and constraints that Russian intelligence assessment had identified in American rules of engagement and response doctrine in confined water environments. According to a former senior U.S. Fifth Fleet officer interviewed by Defense News, the pattern of IRGCN operations in the Strait in the 18 months preceding this confrontation showed a level of tactical sophistication and operational security discipline that was qualitatively different from Iranian behavior in previous periods, suggesting external operational planning input that exceeded Iran's organic military planning capacity based on historical performance. The third element was a coordinated information warfare operation jointly designed by Russian and Iranian state media and influence infrastructure to shape international perception of Strait of Hormuz incidents in ways that maximized political costs for American responses while minimizing reputational damage to the Russia-Iran axis, regardless of operational outcomes on the water. Russian state media outlets with established international reach amplified Iranian narratives about American aggression in the Gulf, providing a global platform for Iranian claims that Iranian state media alone could not have accessed, given its more limited international credibility. The fourth element, and the one whose exposure by American intelligence has proven most damaging to both parties, was a Russian-facilitated back-channel communication system linking IRGCN operational commanders with Kremlin-connected private military company networks operating in the broader Middle East theater, providing operational coordination and information sharing that bypassed official government communication channels in ways specifically designed to create deniability for Moscow if any element of the joint operation was publicly exposed. What the United States military executed in response to the intelligence picture that American analysts had been assembling for months was not reactive. It was not improvised in response to a specific Iranian provocation that triggered an emergency American decision. It was a pre-planned, sequenced operational response that had been prepared precisely because American intelligence had developed sufficient understanding of the Russia-Iran joint architecture to know that direct confrontation in the Strait was the most likely near-term scenario and to prepare responses calibrated to dismantle the architecture rather than simply respond to its outputs. According to reporting from U.S. Central Command and corroborated by statements from unnamed senior defense officials cited by the Wall Street Journal, American forces moved into the strait with a combination of assets specifically selected for their relevance to the specific capabilities that the Russia-Iran joint operation had deployed. MQ-9 Reaper maritime surveillance drones maintained continuous coverage of every IRGCN vessel involved in harassment operations from departure through completion, documenting every movement with targeting quality precision that made the operational patterns visible and counterable before they could develop into genuine threats to American vessels or commercial shipping. Electronic warfare assets deployed by U.S. Fifth Fleet surface vessels systematically degraded the Russian-provided signals intelligence collection infrastructure along the Iranian coastline, not by physically destroying it in ways that would constitute an act of war requiring a formal military response, but by creating electromagnetic conditions in the strait that rendered the collection systems operationally ineffective without providing either Russia or Iran a clear attribution event they could use to justify escalation. Most significantly, American intelligence shared with regional partners a sufficiently detailed picture of the Russia-Iran joint operations architecture that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf Cooperation Council members could independently verify American characterizations of what Moscow and Tehran had been building in the strait, eliminating the information ambiguity that the operations designers had been counting on to prevent regional coalition formation against it. The Russian dimension of this failure is what transforms this from a significant Iranian military setback into a strategic catastrophe that reverberates far beyond the Persian Gulf. Russia has spent 3 years since the beginning of its full-scale Ukraine invasion presenting its relationship with Iran as a model of how sanctioned powers can build effective operational partnerships that challenge American dominance in regions outside the direct conflict theater. The Strait of Hormuz operation was in many ways the flagship demonstration of that model, the most sophisticated and operationally significant joint initiative that the Russia-Iran axis had attempted anywhere in the world. Its public failure, documented by American intelligence, exposed to regional partners, and visible in the behavioral changes of both Iranian military commanders and Russian state media communicators in the aftermath, constitutes a reputational damage to Russian military advisory credibility that extends to every other theater where Moscow is currently presenting itself as a capable and reliable operational partner. In Syria, where Russian military presence has been sustained partly on the basis of Russian claims about the value of its operational expertise and intelligence support to partner forces, local commanders are now assessing Russian advisory value through the lens of what Russian expertise delivered in Hormuz. In Africa, where Russian private military company networks have been expanding their presence across multiple countries on the basis of arguments about Russian military effectiveness against Western-backed adversaries, governments evaluating Russian partnership offers are incorporating the Hormuz failure into their assessment of what Russian operational support actually delivers under pressure from a fully prepared American response. According to analysis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace based on diplomatic reporting from multiple regional capitals, the damage to Russian credibility as a military partner is being described by diplomats in terms that suggest it will take years rather than months to repair, if it can be repaired at all, given the comprehensive and public nature of the operational failure in the strait. Iran's position in the aftermath of this failure is simultaneously simpler and more desperate than Russia's. Russia can absorb the Hormuz failure as one setback among many in a global competition that Moscow frames as a long game measured in decades. Iran cannot absorb this failure with similar equanimity because the consequences of the operation's collapse are not primarily reputational, but immediately material in ways that the regime's financial and logistical management capacity is struggling to address in real time. The Iranian rial, which had already lost more than 80% of its value against the dollar since 2018, according to International Monetary Fund data, entered a new and accelerating phase of deterioration in the days following the exposure of the Russia-Iran joint operation, as currency market participants incorporated into their pricing models the strategic signal that Iran's most sophisticated external supported deterrence architecture had been publicly dismantled by American forces. Iranian oil exports, which the regime depends upon for approximately 40% of total government revenue, according to the IMF's most recent Article or 4 consultation on Iranian public finances, were already running below the threshold necessary to fund current government expenditure commitments before the Hormuz operation's failure removed whatever residual deterrence posture had been keeping international shipping insurance markets from applying maximum risk pricing to Gulf transit routes adjacent to Iranian territorial waters. According to Lloyd's of London market data cited by Bloomberg, shipping insurance rates for Hormuz transit have reached levels not seen since the most acute phase of the tanker wars of the late 1980s, a comparison that carries enormous significance for Iranian strategic planners because the tanker wars ended with Operation Praying Mantis destroying half of Iran's operational naval fleet in a single day, the most devastating military defeat in the Islamic Republic's history. The parallel is not lost on Iranian commanders, and the behavioral signals emanating from IRGCN leadership in the aftermath of this failure, documented by Iran International through monitoring of state media and official communications, suggest an institution in acute institutional stress, trying to process a failure that its existing doctrinal framework cannot adequately explain. The economic dimensions of the failure compound each other in ways that make sequential management impossible and simultaneous crisis response beyond the regime's demonstrated capacity. Iranian food import costs, already elevated by currency deterioration that had reduced the rial's purchasing power by over 80% from its pre-sanctions baseline, are now being further pressured by the shipping cost increases that flow from elevated insurance rates throughout the Gulf region. Iran imports approximately 30% of its basic food requirements, according to United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization data, and when both the currency is depreciating and the shipping costs for food imports are rising simultaneously, the pressure on domestic food prices reaches levels that historically have preceded the kind of street-level economic discontent that Iranian security services work hardest to suppress. The regime's foreign exchange reserves, which were already being drawn down at rates that IMF economists cited by the Financial Times privately assessed as unsustainable beyond a 12 to 14-month horizon, are now facing accelerated drawdown pressure as the regime attempts to use dollar reserves to support the rial at levels that prevent the currency collapse from triggering visible food security deterioration before the regime can develop a credible narrative response to the Hormuz failure. This is a finite resource being consumed at an accelerating rate to manage a crisis whose underlying causes the available resources cannot address, which is the definition of a deteriorating situation rather than a stabilizing one. Russia's response to the failure of the joint operation has itself become a secondary crisis for Iran because Moscow's behavior in the immediate aftermath has confirmed the assessment that Iranian officials have privately been making about the limits of Russian partnership for longer than they have been willing to state publicly. According to reporting from Reuters and the Financial Times based on diplomatic sources in multiple regional capitals, Russian state media's coverage of the Hormuz confrontation has been carefully constructed to minimize any acknowledgement of Russian involvement in the operation whose failure it is covering, a communications posture that serves Russian reputational interests by preserving deniability but directly undermines Iranian interests by leaving Tehran without the external validation that joint operation framing would have provided if the operation had succeeded. Russian Foreign Ministry spokespersons asked directly about reports of Russian electronic warfare system deployments at Iranian coastal facilities, gave responses whose careful construction around denials of specific technical details while avoiding categorical denials of the broader operational relationship was noted by experienced Russia watchers at major international financial institutions as the diplomatic formulation that Moscow uses when it wants to maintain deniability without making statements that subsequent evidence could definitively contradict. For Iranian officials who had been presenting the Russia-Iran strategic partnership to their domestic audience as a relationship of equals, united by shared opposition to American hegemony, Moscow's communications posture in the aftermath of the Hormuz failure has provided painful confirmation that the relationship is structured very differently from that public framing, with Russia extracting strategic benefits from Iranian operational risk-taking while carefully preserving its own ability to distance itself from Iranian failures when they occur publicly enough to carry reputational cost. The 14-day window that transforms this situation from serious to acute is defined by a physical infrastructure constraint whose timeline is measurable, whose consequences are predictable, and whose resolution requires either diplomatic achievements or operational adjustments that neither Russia nor Iran currently has the capacity to deliver in the time available. According to credible reporting from Iran International, corroborated by satellite imagery analysis from commercial intelligence providers whose data was cited by Bloomberg, oil storage capacity at Iran's primary export terminal at Karg Island is approaching the operational limits of its physical infrastructure because the combination of reduced export demand following the Hormuz operation's public failure, elevated shipping insurance costs that have reduced buyer willingness to accept delivery through Gulf routing, and the absence of the Russian-facilitated back-channel commercial arrangements that had been helping Iran route oil exports through third-party intermediaries is creating inventory accumulation that the terminal cannot absorb beyond a 10 to 12-day window from current reporting. When storage capacity is reached, the choices available to Iranian production managers are operationally straightforward and strategically catastrophic in equal measure. Emergency export arrangements through alternative routing require diplomatic preparations and logistical coordination that take more time than the storage constraint allows. Production curtailment to match constrained export capacity directly reduces the oil revenue that a government already consuming foreign exchange reserves at an unsustainable rate to support its currency cannot afford to lose without triggering the visible fiscal crisis that state media is currently working to prevent the domestic audience from perceiving as imminent. This convergence of a publicly exposed and dismantled joint operation, a Russian partner conducting strategic distancing rather than solidarity reinforcement, an accelerating currency and fiscal deterioration measured in days rather than months, a physical infrastructure crisis with a 10 to 14-day deadline, and a military institution in acute doctrinal crisis trying to process a failure. Its framework cannot explain has created a situation inside Iranian strategic decision-making that the regime's existing crisis management capacity was simply not designed to handle at this level of simultaneous pressure across this many dimensions at once. The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of the world's oil through 34 miles of water. For 2 years, Russia and Iran had been quietly building the architecture to turn that choke point into a lever of strategic influence that could be applied against American interests whenever the bilateral logic of the partnership required a demonstration of coordinated capability. The United States military dismantled that architecture with a precision that left no ambiguity about American intent, American capability, or American willingness to act decisively in the strait, regardless of the broader strategic context created by simultaneous commitments in other theaters. Russia's credibility as a military partnership enabler has been damaged across every theater where Moscow has been selling that credibility. Iran's deterrence architecture has been publicly exposed as insufficient against a fully prepared American response, even when enhanced by Russian electronic warfare and operational planning support. And the countdown running on Iranian oil storage infrastructure means that the strategic consequences of this double failure will become impossible to conceal from domestic Iranian audiences within days, not weeks, creating the kind of visible crisis convergence that changes political calculations inside regimes that had been managing deterioration slowly enough to prevent it from becoming undeniable all at once. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications immediately. Every development in this rapidly evolving crisis will be covered here with the same depth of sourcing and strategic analysis you just watched. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Russia will increase its support to Iran to try to salvage the partnership's credibility? Or will Moscow continue distancing itself and leave Tehran to manage this failure alone? Every single comment gets read. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay ahead, and I will see you in the next brief.